Australia has 5 times the rate of homelessness as Finland. So that's a big difference. Finland is a world leader. It's got them down by explicitly having a housing first principle, by looking at homeless people and not saying, well, you know, we need to look at your individual characteristics, your issues, whatever they may be, if you have mental health issues, substance abuse issues. They say what you need is a house, and then those other issues might then be tackled.
One for mum, one for dad, and one for the country.
And there has never been a more exciting time to be an Australian.
Budgets are about choices, Fran, and you show what you value through the choices you make.
Dead, buried, cremated.
This is coal. Don't be afraid. Don't be scared.
The Treasurer knows.
Australia's basically done for. We'll just end up being a third-rate economy. You know, a banana republic.
How good is Australia?
Just follow the money.
G'day and welcome to Follow the Money, the Australia Institute's podcast that explains big economic issues in plain English. I'm Ebony Bennett, Deputy Director at the Australia Institute, and today on Follow the Money, we are going to talk about the issue on everyone's lips, housing affordability.
One of the most important issues is housing affordability. Many young people fear they will never be able to buy a home in...
Australian mortgage holders could be dealt a major blow tomorrow with the Reserve Bank...
decided to increase the cash rate by 25 basis points to
Australia's first rate rise in more than a decade.
It is the first during a federal election campaign since 2007 when John Howard was Prime Minister.
Should add $78 a month to an average mortgage on a variable rate.
Best way to support people who are renting a house is to help them buy a house.
Australian Labor government will help you achieve the great Australian dream of home ownership.
The focus has been on first home buyers and home ownership, and that's been at the cost of the rental market.
Increases in rent are far outstripping wages.
With thousands of Australians facing homelessness,
I think in some parts of the country we've got a humanitarian crisis.
The Reserve Bank today increased interest rates for the first time in more than 11 years. The 25 basis point hike takes the cash rate to 0.35%. This is going to be of big concern to people who are mortgaged to the hilt, but it also has wider implications for housing affordability. And the reality is Australia does have an acute housing affordability crisis. Home ownership among young people is in sharp decline, rents have been rising, and older women over 55 have been the fastest growing cohort of those experiencing homelessness. Both the government and opposition have announced various policies this election campaign that are aimed at housing affordability. But how do other countries approach making housing affordable and accessible to low and middle income earners? To unpack that question, I'm joined by Professor Andrew Scott, head of the Australia Institute's Nordic Policy Centre and a Professor of Politics and Policy at Deakin University. G'day, Andrew. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Ebony. Good to join you.
Andrew, just starting out, I know you've recently released research into housing affordability as part of the Nordic Policy Centre. What are some of the reasons that Australia has a housing affordability problem?
Well, one of the main ones is that we're so skewed towards investors rather than looking at homes primarily as places to live, seeing them as objects for financial gain and not meeting the basic human need for decent, quality, secure housing first before these become objects for financial appreciation.
And Australia kind of has a reliance on a particular type of housing, and that's really the private market. Is that right?
Absolutely. More than 90% of people in Australia either privately own, paying off a mortgage in many cases, or privately rent. And there's very few other options, and that's part of the problem.
Yeah, so just take us back, because I believe in the part of the research report that you wrote, you kind of go into a bit of history of how Australia has approached housing affordability in the past. How did we used to do it?
Well, there was a stronger public housing sector in the past. After the Second World War, post-war reconstruction, Commonwealth state housing agreements built up significant investments in public housing, and they continued for decades. So public housing was seen as a respectable, legitimate option for people who needed it, and it was a significant enough part of the market to make a difference, to meet people's needs in transition to for young people towards perhaps privately owning one day. But that public housing sector has been run down very drastically, and it's now only 4% of all housing stock.
Only 4% of housing. So 96% of housing is not public housing. It makes up barely anything in the Australian market.
That's right.
That's very depressing because we know that there's huge demand out there for public housing, presumably, and we just haven't kept up with that demand. Presumably there's a whole bunch of people missing out because it's now only at 4%. Is that right?
Absolutely the case. And, such a privatised housing market, such a profit-driven housing market means that so many people are paying far too much for housing and simply can't afford it. And we're at a real impasse in Australia now. The decline of public housing is part of it, but so too is the fact that private renting is so expensive. And there are a number of other approaches that can be taken to rectify this.
Advocates for tenants say the issue of rent has been getting little attention this election cycle. It's the cost of living as well as interest rates grabbing all of the headlines. A new Anglicare rental affordability study has found that less than 2% of the nation's rental properties are affordable for tenants on the minimum wage.
Imagine a place where housing affordability is not an issue. Our guests today say these utopias do exist and we could emulate them too with the right policies here. Dr. Sissel Grimstad is a Norwegian-born international expert on cooperative housing. She's a senior lecturer in the College of Human and Social Futures at our very own University of Newcastle. And Professor Andrew Scott is the convener of the Australia Institute's Nordic Policy Centre. Hello, Andrew.
Yeah, so tell us about that, because obviously the research paper explores how the Nordic countries approach it. And I feel like so often in the Australian debate, it becomes a question of merely tax reform, which for various reasons is kind of off the political agenda at the moment, or, reducing red tape and increasing supply on the other side, and kind of these marginal schemes at the margins. But that all still really focuses, doesn't it, on, first home buyers grants and things like that. How do the Nordic countries approach it? What makes their approach different?
Well, one of the big differences comes back to that public housing question, because in Sweden, for example, they had, after post-war, as part of post-war reconstruction, a major public housing initiative like Australia did, but they didn't then squander it. They didn't then run it down. They kept it going. And indeed, they expanded it. So between 1965 and 1974, the Swedish government deliberately built 1 million homes. And that has left an amazing legacy. It meant that 1/5 of all homes in Sweden from the 1970s were sound, spacious, well-planned and efficiently equipped dwellings of reasonable cost rented from public local authorities. And today, more than 30% of all Swedes live in rental housing. Of those, half live in municipally owned public rental housing.
Sorry, can you just repeat that? Those numbers?
Okay, so in Sweden, between 1965 and 1974, 1 million homes were built by the national government in cooperation with other tiers of government. Then that left a legacy, the Million Program, as it's called, which continues today. It meant in the first instance that during the 1970s, 1/5 of all homes in Sweden were sound, spacious, well-planned, efficiently equipped dwellings of reasonable cost rented from public local authorities.
1 in 5. That is just amazing, isn't it?
It is. And of course, if 1 in 5 people in the country are living in them, they're mainstream. They're not universal, but they are mainstream. They're not unusual. They're not residual or stigmatised.
Yeah, definitely. And the other interesting thing that you explored in particular was the models of cooperative housing. Now, for people who've never encountered that type of idea before, can you just explain what it is and how it works?
Okay, well, our paper has a great section by Sissel Grimstad, who has a PhD and is Norwegian, but has been in Newcastle, New South Wales University for many years. And she writes about how mainstream cooperative housing is also in Sweden, Denmark and Norway. So we said 1/5 of Swedes were living in public rental accommodation. That's true. Now 1/5 of Danes are living in cooperatives. Rental cooperatives.
The difference between a strata housing and co-op housing is that
Whereas a strata unit can be an investment object in a co-op. The flat is actually, you have to live in the flat that you own, so you can't use it to rent out separately.
So how it works is essentially that cooperative housing associations got together with trade unions to buy into the market and to set up cooperatives. And if you're a member of a cooperative, you can rent from it. And there are also ownership cooperatives. So you can own your individual dwelling as part of a cooperative, a housing cooperative where other parts of the complex are shared and you don't own those parts.
Okay, so just to break that down a bit, for the rental cooperatives, you're a member of the cooperative and you're kind of renting from the cooperative your space. And in the ownership cooperatives, you own perhaps your dwelling and then the cooperative maintains some shared spaces, effectively like a strata here. Would that be kind of similar?
Yes. The strata title, which we're reasonably familiar with in Australia, you're in your individual unit in a block of apartments, for example, but the staircases, the balconies, etc., the public balconies or the car spaces and so on are publicly maintained, shared. Now, one of the big differences, however, is that we know that many of those strata title units are owned by investors who don't live in the apartments. In the Nordic countries, you need to live in the apartment to own it.
That's a big difference indeed, isn't it? And so I guess that's one of the major differences, that in the Nordic countries, they're focused on a house first, people having a roof over their head first, and investors are kind of a secondary, I guess, consideration compared to how Australia approaches things from a policy perspective.
Yes, that's absolutely the case. Housing to meet people's needs for secure, quality accommodation, a roof over their head, shelter, a place to enjoy life for individuals and families and whoever lives in those places. I mean, Australia is fairly unusual in the extent to which it has given government incentives for people to invest and distort prices in the property market through tax concessions, negative gearing, and in a way that crowds out and prices out people who need to find their first home as a higher priority before someone gets their fourth or fifth home.
Traditionally, regional Australia was where people on low incomes would move to try and find cheaper rent, somewhere that was a bit more affordable to live. They're being hit hardest here. They are being evicted, in some cases onto the streets. We've got people living in cars.
According to the other issue the paper explores is homelessness, and there's a section from Dr. Heather Holst on how Finland tackled homelessness. I know during the pandemic, Australia managed to find homes or housing for a lot of people sleeping rough as part of the response to the pandemic and as part of health measures. But apart from that, we seem to tolerate a lot of homelessness, essentially. How does Finland approach it?
Well, Finland has reduced homelessness very significantly. Australia has 5 times the rate of homelessness as Finland. So 1 per 1,000 people in Finland is homeless, 5 per 1,000 people is in Australia. That's a big difference. Finland is a world leader, and it used to have higher levels of homelessness. It's got them down by explicitly having a housing first principle, by looking at homeless people and not saying, well, we need to look at your individual characteristics, your issues, whatever they may be, if you have mental health issues, substance abuse issues. They say what you need is a house, and then those other issues might then be tackled. So it is a different approach. It's deceptively simple, but sometimes the simple approaches can be radically inclusive. The obvious approaches can be overlooked, and they've done what to many would seem intuitively obvious, and it's got remarkably good results by world standards.
And as we said earlier, education, the economy, jobs, your health, they all fall in a heap if you haven't got secure and affordable housing to do those from.
Andrew, I'm just curious, going back to the idea of cooperatives, I guess, just because that seems like such a different model to what we have operating in Australia. We've already heard the Prime Minister kind of rubbish the Labor Party's idea of the government having an equity stake in housing.
A pledge to help 10,000 Australians get into the market with just a 2% deposit, with a Labor government purchasing up to 40% of their property. A shared equity scheme open to people earning up to $90,000.
Our plan is for Australians to own their own home, not for the government and Anthony Albanese to own your home.
But in a cooperative housing unit, how is it different to private ownership, I guess, is what I'm aiming at in terms of, you know, how it works and how people treat it and how it's seen in that society?
Okay, cooperative ownership in Nordic countries is seen as ownership. It's counted as private ownership in the statistics and so on. And you do own the most important things, which is your individual dwellings, and where you obviously have your private space and all that sort of thing. But that takes place in a context where there are some shared spaces and you are a member of a cooperative. Probably the most important difference is that the cooperative is not for profit. So you are not owning this house, you know, in order to accumulate wealth. And because the cooperative is not run for profit, proceeds from the cooperative go to reinvesting in keeping the property of a high standard, upgraded, that sort of thing. So it is individual ownership in a somewhat more cooperative or public context. And it has come about through the efforts of cooperative housing associations working with trade unions. The reason I mention that as important or relevant for Australia is that the closest entity we may have to this is industry superannuation funds, which of course were formed by trade unions with employer support. And it's often thought, including by some of those key super funds themselves, that they could invest more, or at least a small proportion of their large amounts of collective capital in Australia in affordable housing, which would help set up their members better for retirement than by not investing in that way.
And just correct me if I'm wrong here, but housing cooperatives have other ways of ensuring security of tenure, things like subletting being strictly regulated, that Airbnb is kind of not permitted, and things like, correct me if I'm wrong, that rather than whoever's the biggest, you know, house in the strata kind of has more say on the strata, that everyone who's a part of the cooperative kind of has an equal say about what's done with the community property and that type of thing. Is that broadly accurate?
It's absolutely accurate, yes. And of course that might be a difference from Australians' notion of ownership. If my house is bigger than yours, I've got more say. You know, the vote goes with the money, but that's not the way cooperatives work. Members have an equal vote, like we do in national elections, and that is an egalitarian concept. And I think, you know, the Australian housing market desperately needs a bit more of egalitarianism, cooperation and public content.
Yeah, we've certainly gone from, I mean, there's just a whole generation of young people that just kind of, it seems an absolute pipe dream that they'll ever buy a home, let alone have, you know, security of tenure in rental arrangements and things like that. So it's certainly, you know, worth considering what other options are out there, I'd guess. And overall, can you just give us a picture of how different that market is overall when it comes to cooperatives, public housing, community housing, social housing, compared to what Australia is like at the moment?
Well, I think the key difference is you've got diversity there. You've got different options for different cohorts. There's no problem with individuals owning their own home, and some will own much more fancy homes than others, according to their wealth, that sort of thing. But if you've got 5 options rather than 2, then you're going to have ways of meeting needs of different groups better. And that's the key thing. We're talking about widening the repertoire in Australia beyond private home ownership and beyond private renting. So we look after public renters, we look after people who live in cooperative arrangements, and we have a restored public housing sector.
And what kind of difference would that make to Australian society, you know, if we had more secure housing available for a whole range of people?
Well, secure housing underpins so many other things. If you have secure housing, you can then develop people's interests, time devoted to certain things, including study or work, other engagement. If you don't have a home, there's very little you can do. It's a terrible situation. Insecurity of housing causes many social problems, including for single parents and their children who are disrupted with their schooling and friendship groups and so on. So we would have a better Australian society, and part of the policy approach with these housing different strands of policy is to achieve social mix. So different people, different types of people, different varieties of people living near each other promotes equality and understanding and harmony.
In Australia right now, there's a 100% government-owned agency called the Defence Housing Authority, and there's a hint in the name. It provides housing for people in defence. And there's no stigma attached. There's no shame or embarrassment attached to Defence Force personnel living in low-cost, high-quality homes provided to them. And I don't begrudge them that at all. But why couldn't we have the Nurses Housing Authority, or the Teachers Housing Authority, or the Childcare Workers Housing Authority? We could just actually have a housing authority that did it.
And of course, as you've said in the past, Australia did invest seriously in public housing, for example, and that's something we've kind of let go by the wayside. But you know, we do things like provide defence personnel with housing. It's not unknown for the government to intervene to provide housing, for example. So these are some other options that are, you know, available to us.
Exactly right. Yeah, defence public housing, not widely known, but yes, it's there. And public housing for groups that have particular needs, including women who are victims of domestic violence, emergency service workers who've been displaced with COVID, and many categories of our society can be earmarked for public housing, and that will bring many benefits. I really just want to reinforce the value of looking beyond the English-speaking countries. And we've been pleased at the response to this report, because quite a few people who hadn't previously engaged with the Nordic Policy Centre have really taken an interest in this report, because they can see there's something going on here when you look beyond the Anglosphere that is offering more hope and for possibility of effective policy change in Australia to tackle housing unaffordability.
And just more choice, you know, that there's a bigger suite of options compared to just, as you said, private renting or private ownership.
Indeed there is.
Thank you so much for joining us today, Andrew. We'll wrap it up there. This episode was recorded on Tuesday, the 3rd of May, and things may have changed since recording. You can visit australiainstitute.org.au for all our latest research and content, and we're on Twitter at the Oz Institute with an AUS. You can also visit the Nordic Policy Centre and its website for the full report as well. My Twitter handle is ebony_Bennett with a _N_T. Andrew Scott is at @ScottNLights. That's the letter A, Scott with a _T, the letter N, and then the word lights. @ScottNLights. This episode was produced by Jennifer Macy, and you can find her at Jennifer Macy, with additional editing by Louise Osborne. Our theme music is by Jonathan McFeet from Pulse and Thrum, with additional music from Blue Dot Sessions. Don't forget to leave us a review if you enjoy the podcast, as it helps other people to find us. If you're looking for another great podcast, have a listen to Life's Lottery from the Paul Ramsay Foundation. It's a podcast about breaking the cycle of disadvantage, and their new season explores what it would take to truly put kids at the heart of policy, of budgets, and broader public work. Check it out. Stay safe out there, and thanks for listening.